Hello and happy 2019. Glad you joined me. Today I'm going to go over my top 10 picks, favorite books from 2018. Join me after the intro. Welcome to my top 10 favorite books from 2018. Before I get into the list, let me explain how I came to it. I tried to pick books from the last 2 or 3 years. So it's not going to be strictly favorite books from published in 2018, but my favorite books that I read in 2018. However, I did try to constrain it to recent books from the last 2 or 3 years. So books that I read from 10 or 15 years ago are not included. For example, I strongly considered including Steve Martin's memoir about becoming a stand-up comic because it moved me so much. But in the end, I decided not to include it. Second point about the list, I include nonfiction, fiction, and graphic novels. So it's going to be a very wide-ranging list. And I hope that this, including these different books, these different kinds of books, makes this a little more different from other lists that you can find on the internet or on YouTube. So I hope that for those who are into graphic novels, you'll discover some other books that maybe interest you. Or for the people who like fiction, you'll find nonfiction. I just hope by being inclusive, it'll open people's minds to many kinds of reading material. Something else I want to note, going over the list, I noticed very few books from 2018 made my top 10. I think the majority are from 2017. A number of them I read in January, February when I was trying to catch up with my reading from 2017, and at that point I had the benefit of, let me fix my shirt, there we go. I had the benefit of best of the year lists, so I was able to kind of cherry pick. However, there is some books, very strong books, very high on the list from 2018. And I think there was one, there was one other thing I wanted to mention that it escapes me now. Okay, so, oh, that's right. I wanted to mention honorable mentions before we get into the list. So, The Mars Room by, I think it's Rachel Kushner. Forgive me, I was going to write down the honorable mention list, and I decided, oh, I won't include it. And then just as I'm filming, I decided to include it. But The Mars Room was an almost on the list. Dennis Johnson's collection of short stories, his last collection of short stories, was a very good collection. And almost on the list, got bumped in the last week of the year, was Tom King's Mr. Miracle. The main reason it didn't make the list was I think it failed at the very end. The conclusion kind of failed. If it nailed the conclusion, it'd be here. Number 10 on my list, which I'm going to get to in 2 seconds, that would not be here. That would be Tom King's Mr. Miracle. But the number 10 made the list, and for good reason. So, number 10, Reagan, An American Journey by Bob Spitz. And it was published in 2018, so one of the books from this year that I included in the list. And it received on Goodreads a score of 4.0, which is quite high. It goes up to 5. Goodreads goes up to 5. Anything over 4 is a very good score. And my method for reviewing the books is to give the first sentence of the book, to give just the briefest flavor, because usually the writers are establishing a tone with the first sentence, and then to give my overall thoughts, not to really go over the plot, but to just give my thoughts about the book. You can always discover the plot on your own just by going on Amazon or Goodreads or any other source. So the first sentence of the book, Ronald Reagan had lost his way. And I listened to an interview with Bob Spitz last night as research for my reviews, for my list. And he said that came to him, that was the last thing that came to him, was this idea that in the mid-1950s, Ronald Reagan's career as an actor had dried up. He was doing TV. I can't remember if he was doing Death Valley Days at this point, but he found himself as the MC of a musical comedy review show in Vegas. Kind of a C-list, maybe even a D-list. Not quite Z-grade, but kind of down there. And he enjoyed the work, but him and Nancy spent a lot of time in a hotel. And for Bob Spitz, that time in Vegas was the time, I think Reagan gave a speech, but it was the time where Reagan kind of decided on his political career. And that brings me to my next point, and that is that this book is a very interesting mix. It's part presidential biography, it's part entertainment bio, and it gives a view of Hollywood in the late 30s and 40s when Reagan was working in film, so the golden age of Hollywood. And it's also part hagiography because it goes into the childhood of Reagan. And Reagan's development politically is very interesting. He's famously a liberal turned conservative. So Bob Spitz puts a lot of focus on that journey that Reagan took. And he develops Reagan's thoughts very fully throughout the book, so that when the turn occurs, it doesn't feel sudden. He lays the seeds throughout the book. It's one of the strengths of the book. Spitz's focus on Reagan's journey from liberal to conservative is very interesting. The way the fact that he changed his ideology. Most people do not, once they've settled in on a political ideology, they're fixed. Few people change. Christopher Hitchens is another famous example of someone who I think went from liberal to conservative. But Reagan's is among the most famous because he became president of the United States. So there's the content, the material that Spitz has to work with. And then secondly, Spitz tells a good story. He gets you engrossed. He has a good subject to tell a story about, and he tells it very well. And I enjoyed reading every page of it, and that's why it's number 10 on my list. Number 9 on my list is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It was published in 2017, and it received a score of 4.43 on Goodreads. That's a quite strong score. And the opening sentence from the book, it's a nonfiction book, I should mention. When, from 2014 to 2016, riots in places like Ferguson, Baltimore, Milwaukee, or Charlotte captured our attention. Most of us thought we knew how these segregated neighborhoods, with their crime, violence, anger, and poverty, came to be. And Richard Rothstein, I believe, is a lawyer turned writer, or law professor turned writer, and he examines the laws that were put into place that prevented African Americans from buying homes in white communities. These areas where they were prevented, they were separated by red lines, and these were federally mandated areas where it was, as he says, not de facto but de jure. So it wasn't that white realtors were just rejecting African Americans from owning homes in these areas. The law prevented African Americans from owning houses in these areas. So many of them were forced to live in areas with other African Americans, and they were unable to purchase homes even if they wanted to, they had to, I believe, enter into unequal leases where the terms of the lease were, and I'm trying to remember this correctly, terms of the lease were construed in a way where it would be quite easy for the bank to later take the home from the owners for violations of the lease. They could even just not accept payment from the owners, even when the owners tried to pay, and then claim default on the loan, which they would then flip those houses to new owners and repeat the process again and again, trapping African Americans from upward mobility and confining them to areas where crime began to be prevalent, creating a circle of poverty for one particular race. And it's a little heavy reading, but for me, very eye-opening. He starts the book with a section on San Francisco to show how even in a liberal area like California, these areas existed. And I lived in San Francisco for 15 years, and there's an area near Japantown, the Western Addition, where it might be, no, it's not Divisadero. I can't remember which street goes through there, not Van Ness. But on one side are the wealthier homes, and there's a large wall that separates the homes from the road, a raised area. And then on the other side are the Section 5 homes, where the lower income people live. And in separating those two areas in this busy road are these large walls. And I think in Los Angeles, there are areas where literally you're on the wrong side of the track. These large walls separate the freeway from the areas where African Americans could purchase homes. His point being that the racism that prevented African Americans from upward mobility and owning homes was so common that even in a place like San Francisco, it existed. And that was my number 9. Number 8 on my list is American Wolf by Nate Blakeslee, and it was published in 2017. And this was a book on PBS NewsHour's book club. Now read this. There are a few, I think 3 books on the list come from Now Read This. Very, very worthwhile book club. If you're not in it, I suggest checking it out. You can find their page on Facebook, and it's partnered with New York Times. So New York Times provides editorial content, research content, and then at the end of the month, PBS interviews the author of the book, taking questions from viewers for the author. And I actually appeared on PBS NewsHour asking a question for the author of Pachinko, which was my number 1 book from 2017. Opening sentence of the book. The hunter left his truck at the end of the gravel road and trudged through into the fresh December snow. And Nate Blakeslee is a journalist based out of Austin, Texas. He is mainly a political reporter, which I guess you would seem to make him underqualified for a nature book. This is a book that follows the wolf pack of the so-called most famous wolf, 06, in Yellowstone Park. But, however, there are two main threads to the book. One is the nature biography, the Jack London-esque history of 06 and her wolf pack, which he got by interviewing people who live in Yellowstone. And in Yellowstone, there is a subculture of wolf fiends, wolf fanatics, who follow the wolf packs that live around Yellowstone, around Yellowstone. And one of those had thousands of pages detailing sort of a journal of the wolf pack. And he took those and used those to give us a view into a few years of this wolf pack. And then there's a second track which follows man's intervention, man's conflict with the wolves, and the legislation that has occurred around the wolves, like the people who are opposed to the reintroduction of the wolves that occurs in Yellowstone and wish to have greater hunting numbers, kill numbers, than the law currently allows. And that's where his experience as a political journalist comes to the fore. He is able to step us through the legislative process and interview the people on both sides of this issue. And I think he manages a balanced tone. If you read carefully, you can see where he comes down on the issue of the hunting of the wolves by man, but he gives both sides their chance to express their opinion on the matter, and it's a very fascinating read. That was my number 7. Number 7, We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates, released in 2017. It's a nonfiction collection of his essays, and it received a score on Goodreads of 4.44, another quite strong score. And I've read Between the World and Me and We Were 8 Years in Power, and I've read some of his Black Panther comic books, and out of all that, this is my favorite out of everything that he's written. I think his greatest strength as a writer is in the essay, and these are remarkable. The essay he wrote in this about reparations became quite famous, and I think it's maybe one of the 2 strongest essays in the book. The opening sentence of the book. In 1895, 2 decades after his state moved from the egalitarian innovations of Reconstruction to the oppressive redemption, that's in quotation marks, South Carolina Congressman Thomas Miller appealed to the state's constitutional convention. We were 8 years in power. When I first heard the title of the book, I thought he was referring to Obama, but he's not. He's referring to the time of Reconstruction, when African Americans were able to be elected to hold positions of power in the South. However, like many of the essays in the book, there are echoes to the present day. And he does write about Obama, and I think that it's not coincidental. We Were 8 Years in Power could also refer to Obama, since he goes on to, and this is another famous essay, talk about how Donald Trump is the first white president. He has said in interviews that Donald Trump proves that a person who has the correct skin color can have marginal ability and lots of money and be elected to president, whereas you could never imagine Obama would have failed 6 times in business, 6 bankruptcies in business, and still be elected to be president and say the things that he has said. So many of these essays are about dated topics, but they're still resonant today. He wrote a piece about Bill Cosby that he later regretted, since the allegations about Cosby's rapes did not come out until after the essay was published. But in some ways, it again shows these echoes of how the past and the present resonate if you view them correctly. And the collection of essays in this book takes these lessons from the past and examines them in a way where they are relevant to today. I highly recommend it. Number 6 on the list, The Future is History by Masha Gessen. Came out in 2017, and I believe it won the Pulitzer. No, well, either the Pulitzer or the National Book Award for Best Nonfiction book, and it scored 4.20 on Goodreads, the first sentence of the book. I have been told many stories about Russia, and I have told a few myself. And she said in an interview, she feels like every Russian person has to, or Russian writer has to at one point tell their great Russian novel or their great Russia story. And this was hers. And it's about contemporary Russia, Putin's Russia. And she takes an interesting approach to it. She tells the story of six, seven, or eight people from many different backgrounds in Russia. There's a psychologist, there is a college graduate, there's a fledgling business owner, there is someone who's an aperchik. I messed up that word, aperchik? I think it's aperchik. Member of the Communist Party or from a family that's been members of the Communist Party. One of the members of Pussy Riot is also one of the people. So she's able to take all these different people, all these intellectuals and people related to business, and relate them through how their lives have been affected by Putin. And in almost every case, their lives are ruined because Putin is the ruler of Russia. And I think for anyone who wants an understanding of just how modern Russia works, and wants an understanding of the intellectuals of modern Russia, what their view is, and how they view the West, there is probably not going to be a better book, contemporary book, to this one. So, number 6, highly recommended. Number 5 on my list, Less by Andrew Sean Greer, released in 2017, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and it is a humor novel. And personally, if you've followed me a little bit, you know that I like humor. I feel that it's unappreciated, so I try to go to special effort to focus on it. It was one of the reasons I strongly considered including Steve Martin's memoir in this list. And so for him to win the Pulitzer for a humor novel, he was asked, "Are you surprised that your novel won the Pulitzer?" And he said, "No, it's not that I'm surprised. It's everyone's surprised that I won the Pulitzer." The score, now this is the beginning of a few of the controversial books on the list. Controversial meaning that they have received wide acclaim. They're on my list, but there is a minority for this and the next couple books, a vocal minority that do not like these books. And you can see that reflected in their score on Goodreads. So the score for this book on Goodreads, 3.8. So it's a little low for a book that's received such wide acclaim and won the Pulitzer. Again, I love it. Number 5 on my list. But I want to be honest and report that there is a minority that does not like the book. First sentence from the book. From where I sit, the story of Arthur Less is not so bad. And there is an omniscient narrator to the novel, and one of the surprises of the plot is who is this narrator. It's something I won't reveal here, but grabbing my water. Andrew Sean Greer said that he had always been interested in using a kind of omniscient narrator. There's a certain warmth from the reader for a narrator who is guiding them through the story, kind of develops a rapport that you don't get from third person. And he included it as part of the plot of the story by making this narrator one of the characters and then leaving it as a mystery to who the narrator is. And it's a picaresque novel that takes place in different locales around the world. And the main character, Andrew Luck, is trying to run away from himself, from the troubles in his life, by just going to a new country. But he always finds those troubles following him. And one of the brilliant approaches of this novel, the author meant for it to be a drama. He'd always written drama, very serious novels up to this one. And he intended for this to be serious, but the tone felt wrong. I won't say the tone felt wrong, just it was flat. Something was not working. And he got struck by the lightning bolt of inspiration. What if we change the tone? What if we make it a comedy? And one of the lines that I really adored in the book, someone tells the main character, Andrew Luck, that his philosophy, not Luck's, but his philosophy is that people have one of two lives. They begin their life in tragedy and end in comedy, or they begin in comedy and end in tragedy. And that he had felt Luck was someone who began in comedy but was destined to end in tragedy, but that he had changed his mind, that he was one of the blessed on the earth, the blessed few who began in comedy and would end in comedy. However, the reason for that is the flaw, the character's flaw. He is so oblivious to things around him that he will never recognize the true gravitas of a situation. He will just blunder away into something else. He will always run from tragedy because he lacks that self-recognition. For him, that is a tragic flaw, but the tragic flaw becomes comedy because he just gets himself involved into some weird escapade because his flaw leads him to that, to our betterment, us being the reader. And that is the ironic twist that makes the novel interesting. That, and it's very frothy, very fun to read, very light. So that's why it made my number 5. Now we get to interesting part of the review. As I mentioned at the beginning, I include graphic novels in my list, and there have been none up to now. And because the graphic novels that I read this year that are on the list were quite strong, they're all going to be bunched up near the top here. And this is the first of them. And I want to say I considered capturing images from the graphic novels and then from my computer and then playing them before the review. But I just felt I would be more comfortable using my Kindle Fire and trying to hold the image up to the camera than just putting it before the review. I would like to talk about the images as I show them. However, that means we might get the glare from my lighting equipment. So I'm going to try to do my best. We'll see how this works. Between the two cameras that I'm using, I hope that we'll be able to make this work. Number 4 is Calamity Jane. It is a French graphic novel, first published in 2008, quite a long time ago. However, it was not translated into English until 2018, this year. I should say last year. The author was Christian Perrissin. I really don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Christian Perrissin. And the artist Matthieu Blanchin. I can't read my writing. I apologize. I should have done research on how to pronounce these names. It received a score on Goodreads of 3.82. So again, remember I mentioned in this area of the list there are a few not quite controversial but mixed reception where there is a vocal minority that doesn't like them. And for this one, unless I don't understand why people don't grok it, this one I understand. She is an unsympathetic character, so I get it if people didn't quite get into it. The first lines of the graphic novel, what's indisputable is that Calamity Jane was born May the 1st, 1852, near Princeton, Missouri. And Calamity Jane was famous for telling tall tales about her own life. So trying to be factual can both, quite difficult about her life. And the author notes those areas where he's unable to tell if what Calamity Jane is saying is a tall tale or the truth. It can't be verified. And it plays a lot into her character. Let me show the art style. Let's take care of that now, since we just read the first sentence. Here's the first page. And maybe I can get the autofocus. I'll come in a little closer. Oh, it's showing up a little bit. Oh, there we go. It's a matter of me holding. And the style is almost a sketch style. I like it a lot. It's expressive, but also a little dirty at the same time, and then very clean. He uses a lot of white space. The artist does. For me, it's quite interesting, and he uses it to great effect for capturing the wide vistas of the West. Now, about the story, or biography, comic biography of Calamity Jane. She is, in some ways, a feminist icon. She was quite independent and very strong, and these are the good sides of her character. She, however, was also selfish, vain, and intemperate. And there are a couple people the author points to where they may have died as a result of the selfish actions of Calamity Jane. So that is something that makes her unsympathetic. Fascinating, but unsympathetic. He follows her life from cradle to grave, and she ends up a quite destitute circumstance. So we get more of a tragic end to the life of Calamity Jane, but the road there's quite a wild road, and it's her life story is a good introduction into the American West, since she is one of those gunslingers that have become more myth than real. So that is one of the reasons that that graphic novel made it to number 4 on my list. Number 3 on my list, Sabrina by Nick Drnaso, published in 2018, this year. It's a graphic novel, and this is fiction, not a biography like Calamity Jane. It received a score on Goodreads of 3.83, and this is controversial. This is not just a mixed reception. This book has famously become the first graphic novel to be included on the long list for the Man Booker Prize. And whoo, is there a furore that arose after this was announced on the list. For me, it's a masterpiece. That's why it's so high, number 3. But it's not to everyone's taste. It's very slow. For me, it's fascinating slow. The novel is, graphic novel, is concerned with human behavior and the way that our reactions can be mediated from what we see on the internet and in the press. And Nick Drnaso spends a lot of time in very quotidian dialogue, and he will spend pages just following a person walking down the corridor. So with the people who say the book is boring, I get it. For me, though, there was a tension behind all of it. The mystery of the character Sabrina, I'm not giving away a lot. She does not appear much in the graphic novel, and there's a mystery about where she is and her circumstances. And there's a circle of characters around her that are concerned about her. So all these slower scenes, they're imbued with the mystery of Sabrina, for me. And there's an undercurrent of violence to all the scenes, and there's a slight sardonic, ironic humor. He's been compared to Chris Ware. Chris Ware, I think the comparisons are apt. So let me show you, first of all, the first page. And here you'll see a lot of the panels where there's no dialogue, and he's following a character down a hallway. It's Sabrina, and she's looking for her cat. Now wait, let's get closer. No, the lighting's messing it up. I'm gonna try it on the iPhone. Maybe the iPhone will pick it up. Oh, well, it's good at the angle there, kind of picking it up. But you see, there we go. All these panels of her just walking through the house. Now, this situation gets resolved quite quickly, but there's a character, he's like a military IT guy, and there are scenes of him walking down the access corridors when he's fixing a problem for the internet connection, long panels. And so I get the people who said they were bored. But again, there's the undercurrent of violence and then psychological unease. And a lot of the story takes place in Colorado. And so we get the mountains in the background and the wide expanse. Again, like Calamity Jane, the wide open space of the Rockies, the West, something that people view of America, that wide openness. But for here, that wide openness highlights the emptiness in people's lives. And the meaningless dialogue we have is a symptom of that meaninglessness. And so to resolve that meaninglessness, we find ourselves engaging in conspiracy theories and going onto internet forums and looking at the worst in us in order to find meaning or just find entertainment. But by doing so, we degrade ourselves. That's one of the conflicts of the novel, the graphic novel, is do we have a core of humanity, or will we just sink to our base natures? The internet gives it all to us, and where will we end up? Where will the main characters end up? And I thought the characters are not static. There is growth. So with the slowness, it's like the thawing of the ice. You can't see it, but eventually it happens in a sudden motion. There's the crack, and the change happens, and the state is no longer the same. I thought it was magnificent. I'll definitely read it again in the future, and I think, this is my prognostication, it will be one of the books people talk about when they discuss graphic novels. It will be something they return to again in the future. Number 2 on my list. My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil, Ferris, published in 2017, the first volume of a three-volume graphic novel. And it received a score of 4.12 on Goodreads, which is quite strong. And I was expecting this as I was reading it, because I've heard a few negative comments. I was expecting this to be another one of those with a vocal minority that dislike it, but if there is a vocal minority, it's quite small. What do I say? This has a very interesting art style. She drew the graphic novel using Bic pens, which gives, and also notebook paper. It's supposed to be the journals of a young 12-year-old girl in the 1960s. The illustrations of a girl in her notebook using Bic pens. And so, as they say, limitation is the mother of invention. Sometimes constraining yourself gives you more opportunity, paradoxically. And I think that's the case here. Let me read the opening sentence first, and then I'll show you the artwork. So, I turned up the volume to hide what I was doing, because it would have completely sucked if Mama had come in and found me doing it. But I started moaning real loud, like Diza when he used to have his boy dreams. There are echoes of To Kill a Mockingbird. Just like To Kill a Mockingbird, it captures the innocence of a young girl, but there's also society is in some ways maturing her by showing her the violent side of humanity. And what makes this different is that the main character has a very large imagination. That's her release. And she's into monster movies and monster comic books. So the title of the graphic novel comes from this interest in monsters, and at certain different points in the graphic novel we get these covers to monster comic books. This is the Wolfman. And then here's the first page, done in black and white. And I just love the line work. This is known as cross-hatching, when you're drawing two lines perpendicular to each other to add depth and color to a drawing. And her line work is full of that. Here's the second page. Look how beautiful. Look how beautiful that is. How moody and atmospheric. And the graphic novel, the plus 300 pages, plus 400 pages, is it 800? Wait, I think the second book, this is where I'm getting confused, because the composition of it's a little confusing. I think it was only meant to be just one, but it was so large they broke it into two parts. So I believe this is 400 pages. Volume 2 will be the next 400, and it just evolved into a trilogy. But it was all meant to be just one book. The book is it's very postmodern. It's a kaleidoscope. So it takes place in the early 60s. No, the mid to late 60s, because the death of Martin Luther King is an important part of the book. There's a very heavy scene, but difficult but important scene about the day that Martin Luther King died. So the historical background is important to the book. There is a psychedelic, because it's the 60s, a psychedelic tone to the book. At one point she takes some drugs and trips balls, and those pages are drawn like something out of Zap Comics, any of the underground comics from the 60s. And she has a neighbor. There's a mystery element to it. The mystery is not solved by the end of Volume 1. A neighbor is killed, and the main character gets access to her journals, and she was a Holocaust, the neighbor who was killed was a Holocaust survivor. So parts of the book are from her journal about the Weimar Germany, and as a Jew, how she survived the pogrom that took place in Germany. And that's another interesting tone to the book. The book is just this melange of different styles, all through the eyes of this young girl. And I'm quite eager to see Volume 2. And while I love this, I still have the feeling Sabrina will be something people come back to in the future. This one I'm a little more iffy on. Maybe it's because it's only Volume 1. Maybe after all 3 volumes, when we get the full trilogy, and people tend to weight things in favor of length. If you have 1,200 pages, people tend to just judge that as being more valuable. So maybe after Volume 3, I will come back and say, oh yes, of course, this is a landmark. Nowhere in graphic novels do we have a trilogy like this, with this kind of tone and this magnificent art style. So we'll have to see. As it stands, just off volume 1, I loved it. Placed it higher than Sabrina. But Sabrina is the kind of book I feel people will return to in the future. And next up, my number 1. And now we get to my number 1, which is the memoir Educated by Tara Westover. Released in 2018, it has received a score on Goodreads of 4.48. And I read this. This was on the PBS NewsHour Now Read This book club list, and I read this in April. Nothing came close to topping it at all, ever. And I read it quite quickly. It was very hard to stop reading once I began. And oops, get the shirt straight there. Get ourselves It is a memoir of a girl become woman, a Mormon girl living in the hills of Utah, I want to say, since she's Mormon. Here I should have done research, I don't remember, but her father is a conspiracy theorist and someone believing the apocalypse is nigh. And let me read the first sentence of the memoir. I'm standing on the red railway car that sits abandoned next to the barn. It's written like a work of fiction. It feels very much in the vein of those memoirs that came out in the late 90s, early aughts, that tried to blend fiction and memoir and were the personal grievance books. And in some ways it is. But it's also, as the title says, a hagiography. It's a story of how a girl raised in ignorance becomes aware, becomes woke, to use current lingo, despite her upbringing. It's a remarkable journey. She ends up becoming a Cambridge Fellow. All despite never having received a high school or primary school education. She was homeschooled, and her memoir is a very good argument against homeschooling. Her homeschooling consisted of, as she says, once every few months the mom saying, "Today's school day," and throwing outdated math books and history books at the kids and just leaving the kids to themselves while they spent a few hours doing whatever with the books. The rest of the time she was working, helping her father in their junkyard. Yet she had a brother, a quiet brother, who left the family and went to college and received a diploma as a role model. And she boned down and just, even though she never had any education in high school, elementary school, junior high, nothing, she crammed and crammed. And because she went to what's the college the Mormons go to in Utah, Brigham Young, she received her application was not as scrutinized as it would be at another university, which was to her benefit. And there is a harrowing passage in the book where her lack of education becomes quite apparent to her. It's apparent to us, but apparent to her. And I think it's either in her history class or her art history class. She raises her hand to ask, "What is the Holocaust?" And her friend thinks she's joking, and everyone in the class looks at her aghast. The professor thinks she's joking and answers the question, but says, "Please be more," to all the students, "be more considerate. We shouldn't joke about these kind of things." And that's when she's aware she's so far behind that others are looking at her like they can't understand where she's coming from. To them, it's not a simple question of what is this? To them, it's fundamental knowledge, and she's lacking that fundamental knowledge. And so she does everything she can to overcome the ignorance and sheltered upbringing that she had, to just be cultured, to get to the common understandings that a normal person would have. And how she does that, and the effort she has to take to get to there, and the transformation she makes in the process, is what makes this book so interesting. And the style, it's very well written. She spends a page in the very beginning describing the flowers that are located in the hills of where her house is, and all this becomes important later on, because her family takes the Mormon idea of not using any medicine to an extreme position of never using any medicine. So her mom becomes a holistic healer, using flowers for a kind of snake oil for ailments. And so her knowledge of these flowers becomes relevant later on. But at that time when you read it, it's part of the color of her background. And she is very good at finding details that draw the reader into her world. Highly recommended. Number 1 on my list, and that's it. That's my top 10 of 2018. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that I've inspired you to check out some of these if you haven't already, and maybe you will join me again here. That's all for now. Take care and be well. Her father is a conspiracy theorist / apocalypse. Believe it or not.